Hi everyone, and thanks for watching. I'm Jacky. I'm currently a third-year English undergrad at St. Catherine's College, University of Oxford. And I'm here today to say a bit about the English interviews, as well as show you how I'd go through a piece of poetry that might come up in the interviews. Typically, you would at least have 2 interviews, each lasting about 30 minutes. In at least one of them, though likely in both, you'd be given a passage of prose or poetry to read in advance. The first half of the interview will then involve you explaining your reading of and thoughts on the passage, and as well as involving the tutor asking you questions on it. Afterwards, the interview will broaden out to more general questions and say your personal statement and the texts you've studied at school. Now, obviously, it's very hard for me to summarize general things you should do when preparing the passage as, I'm sure you're aware, each text demands to be treated uniquely, to be close read in its own way. But here are a few things that I think might be universally helpful. Firstly, as you go through the passage, you'll obviously note any literary techniques that you find interesting and muse upon their effects, but don't forget to get a sense of the piece's overall line of thought. In fact, when admissions tutors start off by asking you what you think of the passage, it's always a good idea to say explicitly what you think the poem or the passage of prose is arguing. Secondly, don't clutter the page with your annotations. Now, everyone works differently, but remember that when you're discussing your passage, you'll be very stressed, and it will be a back and forth discussion that can go in any direction, that can refer to different parts of the text, not necessarily in chronological order. So remember to make notes in a way that will be easily readable and referable to you, even in such conditions. Thirdly, be prepared to look hard for formal features, and I'm not talking here about agonizing over whether a certain line exemplifies synecdoche or metonymy, whether it's alliteration or sibilance. Not technical things like these, but rather about the importance of thinking about whether a piece is, say, a sonnet, what are the effects of its rhyme scheme and meter, and so on. So thinking broadly, not only in terms of specific little rhetorical techniques, but also on wider things to do with form. Fourthly, don't panic if you encounter anything you don't understand, whether it be on the level of word or even really on the level of line on a particular area of the poem, a particular section that you feel is not really quite interpretable. Try your best to work out what you can, and then explain, if you really don't know, what it is that you're stuck on. Tutors will help you, and if you can then come up, using their help, with a convincing reading, it reflects really well on your critical and intellectual abilities, and is a clear sign that you can think on your own feet. And finally, but also just as importantly, be receptive to the new information or hints or questions that the tutors give. Whenever they do this, they're trying to guide you to think more deeply about the passage, or to point you to the right direction. So think deeply about and consider the implications of what they're trying to say. Although, of course, it's okay to ultimately disagree with them, but remember always to engage critically with what the tutors offer. Now, on to a practical example of a poem that could come up in the interview. And so if you do get a poem, you'll probably get something that looks like this. Short-ish, around 14 to 20 lines. I'm a bit over here. Usually nuanced in both theme and formal technique, thus offering plenty of grounds for discussion. You should be able to find this poem in its entirety, pardon the pun, by typing its title entirely on Poetry Foundation, and it'd be great if you could read it first before watching the video, and if you like, feel free to annotate the poem and then compare your annotations and insights to mine. I think in this way you can sort of build up a sort of a good critical dialogue with yourself and sort of compare points, see if I'm wrong, see if I've made you think about things a bit differently, and see, where it goes. So, as I just said briefly earlier on, I think the first thing we want to do is to sort of trace the poem's overall line of thought. Now, the poem, as we can see, is titled entirely. Now, it begins with this mysterious it that we can't get the hang of. And the idea seems to be that in this stanza anyways, everything can't be captured. So we can't get the hang of it. All we know is the splash of words and the falling twigs of song. Words and sounds are ephemeral, only splashes in passing. Nor, in fact, are we able to articulate the great presences, whatever they are. Stanza 2, then, moves on to discussing specifically how happiness cannot be entirely secured. We can't find happiness entirely in somebody else's arms. It is ephemeral, can be easily lost, just as love can be banished by bell or siren. Perhaps the bell and siren is a symbol of the disturbance quotidian reality can cause, or perhaps love can be banished by bell or siren because of the deaths and injuries the bell and siren pretend. And finally, stanza 3 takes the theme a bit further and says, well, yes, the world is unpredictable. Nothing should or indeed can be captured in its entirety, but that's the joy of it. So, now, having a rough idea of the poem's gist, we can perhaps zoom in a little bit closer on its intricacies. And all of these things are things, issues, areas that tutors can pick out and ask you about. By the way, I can't show this to you on a computer, but it's always a good idea to number your lines and give line numbers whenever you can in your discussion when you proceed with your analysis. But anyways, so the first thing to notice maybe is that instead of the noun entirety, which I have obviously used, we have the adverb entirely. So I might want to mark it down that it's an adverb here. Now, adverbs, as you probably know, are modifiers. They make an action or a description more precise. But of course, the action and the description could exist without it. So we could get the hang of it, and we could get the hang of it entirely. In a sense, then, does this suggest that entirety as a concept, too, is something that is tacked on, something that could modify something, but could well also be redundant, something we can exist without, in other words? So something worth thinking about, but I won't push this too much or too far, though. Now, looking at stanza 1, the vagueness of this pronoun, it, stands out to me. It's sort of a dangling pronoun, because we don't know what it refers to. Its vagueness, of course, is in itself proof that it cannot be understood entirely. For what is it, anyways? And a similar effect is reinforced in the equally vague phrase, great presences. Because again, what are these great presences? I particularly like the line break here, the enjambement here, because it means that typographically, the concept can't be captured in its entirety. The concept is not captured in one line, but rather is broken into two. In interviews, tutors like discussing figurative language, so you would definitely want to be looking at phrases such as splash of words and also falling twigs of song. For splash of words, I think the idea is that language is as ephemeral as a splash that will disappear in mere seconds. Falling twigs of song is slightly more complex. I think it's about how we will never capture songs in their entirety either, they being parts to whole, as twigs are to trees. And finally, maybe you can give a comment on how our senses even don't coordinate in helping us understand things in their entirety. We try to eavesdrop using our ears, but can't appropriate even a phrase entirely with our verbal capacities. Alright, moving on to stanza 2. I think immediately what's most obvious is that you might want to mull over the phrase, the spears of the spring. Now, it's figurative, it's ambiguous. I actually had no idea what it meant when I took a first look over the poem. So you'd be expecting admissions tutors to be asking you about it. And the key is to not to panic, but try, as I said earlier. So really think out loud. What might these spears be? So what sort of thinking process might you say? Well, you might say to tutors that firstly, they're obviously metaphorical, but you might be confused as to whether they're metaphorical of concrete or abstract things. And you can then say, oh, why don't I sort of raise both possibilities? Say, if it's a concrete thing, is it a spear of grass, for instance? Is it about sort of plants? Raise both possibilities and then tell tutors about your guesses. This is what thinking out loud means. This is how you show you are able to think. So what are these spears then? Well, for me, the key is to think about, well, how they might be spear-like, and how do they, more importantly, each year go through our flesh, and how is this relevant to the idea that happiness cannot be entirely secured? Well, for something to sort of fit all these three categories, I think it might be a bit more abstract. And in this, I'm reminded of T.S. Eliot's famous poem, The Wasteland, which begins with, "April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire." What Eliot is getting at is that April, spring, is cruel, as it is both hopeful, makes you hopeful of the future to come because of regeneration and the newness of things, and yet also makes one nostalgic, drawing up past memories of loss and pain. So maybe these are the spears of spring, a sort of sense of melancholic nostalgia. It would certainly make sense why they would go through our flesh, again metaphorically, because they would sort of cause us pain. And it's also why happiness cannot be entirely secured, because once this melancholy starts coming, all of a sudden, you would be banished from your happy mood. And other than that, you would also want to be prepared to discuss and explain how the almost hourly bell or siren banishes love, as I had tried to do when teasing out the poem's line of thought. So, finally, the last stanza. I think the meaning is straightforward enough. Black or white, and sort of mapping and charting are all symbols of dull control, contrasted with the many-shaped, imaginative, mad wire of Tigrish waters, and prism of delight and pain. Note how the former phrase is so unfamiliar. I'll be honest, I don't know what where means, but this uncommonness, I think, just adds to the effect, that adds to the idea of sort of not being able to encapsulate things in their entirety. And Tigrish, of course, is intensely imagistic. Then the poem finally comes to its conclusion, which is quite prosaically laid out, but our job, I think, is not done yet. Let's now look at the more macroscopic effects of the poem. Well, firstly, rhyme scheme. It's almost all laid out in alternating rhymed couplets, or, if you like, it possesses an AB, 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 AB rhyme scheme. Except this is occasionally broken. So, for instance, lines 1 and 3 do not form a couplet entirely, obviously, does not rhyme with passing. So you have imperfections amidst a generally controlled scheme. Another dramatization, I think, of the way we can never capture anything entirely. Secondly, maybe we can think a bit more about the poem's register. It's quite conversational, isn't it? You have phrases like, get the hang of it, and you have, later on, we might merely be bored. So, what do I think it does? Well, maybe it sort of creates a relaxed and convivial atmosphere that is more about acceptance than pretentious posturing, just in the same way as the poet is asking us to accept life's uncertainties, and to go along with it, to go along with that flow. Now, all this, I think, is way more than you'll probably be able to discuss and need to discuss. But finally, we may want to just think a bit more self-reflexively. And such self-reflexive questions, such meta-literary questions, questions that reflect the literary nature of the text, may come up. Because for all the poem has to say about how we can never truly grasp truths, how all there remain are fragmented bits of words and songs, the poem itself seems to be a complete mode of expression that articulates an entire truth. Now, I don't think the poem is being ironic here, so Are poems perhaps exceptions to what the poet has been discussing? Is it because poems wallow in ambiguity and play in the difficulties of interpretation that they somehow, paradoxically, are able to articulate a certain truth, even if that truth is that there are no entire truths to be encapsulated? I really have no answer, but I think such thoughts would set the stage for a really interesting conversation about literature in general that the rest of the interview can follow on. Some final words before I end. Now, in a sense, you'll be very, very prepared for the interviews, or at least this part of the interviews. You've been close reading intensely for the ELAT just a month ago, and as you head towards your public exams, you will no doubt have continued honing your skills in analysis and interpretation. In another sense, though, the interview will be very different, as it is a quick-fire Socratic dialogue, as opposed to written work where you can sit down and just calmly write out your thoughts. So, always remember to give yourself time to think. Keep an open mind and respond critically to tutors' tips and questions. And, most importantly, enjoy being able to speak your ideas out loud, have them questioned and interrogated, and explore and change the way you think about a piece of writing. All in front of vastly intelligent people who, if all things go well, will teach you for the next 3 years. Good luck.